In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one guardsman, the Imperator, sent an inquisitor to investigate, not for treason, not for heresy, but to find out why he wasn't dead. 50 years, 9 regiments, 7 of which no longer exist. Every man who ever stood beside him in a firing line is in the ground. By every calculation the Munitorum has ever run, he should have died at 19. He kept not dying, and eventually, luck stopped being a satisfactory explanation. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from a man who started as a slag raker at 11 on a furnace world, tithed into the guard at 18, marched away while his mother stood in the doorway, doing the thing she always did, pausing at the threshold, still, listening for something he couldn't hear. He thought it was grief he felt as he turned the corner, a warmth, sudden and sourceless, like a hand pressed flat against his chest from the inside. It took him 50 years to understand what it really was. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
They sent an inquisitor to find out why I wasn't dead. 50 years in the Imperial Guard, 9 regiments, 7 of which no longer exist. Every man who ever stood beside me in a firing line is in the ground on some world I can barely remember. By every calculation the Departamento Munitorum has ever produced, I should have died at 19 on a jungle world whose name I have since learned to hate. But I didn't. I kept not dying. And after 50 years of that, someone finally decided that simple luck was no longer a satisfactory explanation. I grew up on Vothune Tertius, Hive World, Segmentum Tempestus, though I didn't learn what a segmentum was until I was already wearing a uniform someone had shoved onto my back. Vothune is a furnace world dressed up as a hive. The spires exist because someone has to administrate the output, but the real work happens below, in the foundry stacks where the heat never drops below 60 degrees and the air tastes like iron filings and old sweat. My mother worked a press line in Manufactorium Aleph 12. My father I never knew. She told me once he'd been tithed before I was born, sent off-world with the 61st, and that was the end of that conversation. She didn't say whether he was alive or dead, and I didn't ask, because on Vothune the distinction didn't matter much. If you were gone, you were gone. My mother was a quiet woman with strong hands and a habit of pausing before she crossed a threshold, standing still for a moment as if listening for something before she stepped through. I didn't think much of it then. People on Vothune had their habits. The stacks bred them into you, those small rituals of caution that kept you alive in a place where a misstep could put you into a furnace or under a falling beam. I thought she was just being careful. I think about that pause a lot now. I started in the stacks at 11. Slag raker, that was my job. When the furnaces ran their cycle and the molten runoff cooled in the casting troughs, someone had to rake through the hardened slag and pick out the usable metal fragments before the next pour buried them. You worked in teams of 4, 2 raking and 2 hauling, 12-hour shifts in heat that made your skin crack and your eyes feel like they were drying out from the inside. The rake was taller than I was when I started. Heavy iron thing with teeth at the end, worn smooth by 100 hands before mine. You dragged it through the slag in long strokes, listening for the particular scrape that meant you'd hit something worth pulling. After a year, your palms were nothing but callous. After 2 years, you stopped flinching when sparks landed on your arms. By the time I was 15, I could judge the temperature of a slag bed by the color of the glow at its edges, could tell you within a few degrees whether a pore had been clean or contaminated. It was a useful skill. It kept me alive exactly as long as I needed it to, which was until the Munitorum came and decided my hands would be better used holding a weapon. The tithe ships arrived on my 18th year. I remember the sound more than anything else, this deep structural groan that ran through the whole hive as their landing claws locked onto the docking spurs at the upper levels. The administratum officials came down into the lower stacks with their data slates and their servo skulls and their bored expressions, and they counted us like we were ingots waiting to be stamped. They pulled every able body between 17 and 35. My mother watched me go from the doorway of our HAB unit and didn't say anything. She just stood there with her hands hanging at her sides, and the last thing I saw before they marched us up the transit corridor was the burns on her forearms from the press line, still fresh and red. She was doing her pause, standing at the threshold, still, listening for something I couldn't hear. As I turned the corner and lost sight of her, I felt a warmth at the center of my chest, sudden and sourceless, like a hand pressed flat against my sternum from the inside. I put it down to grief, or the nearest thing to grief that an 18-year-old slag raker was capable of feeling. I didn't say goodbye because I didn't think it was goodbye. I thought I'd be back. That's the kind of thing you believe when you're 18 and you've never seen anything beyond the walls of a hive. They put us on a bulk transport called the Vessel of Appropriate Burden, which tells you everything you need to know about the Imperium's approach to naming things. 2 weeks in the hold with 800 other conscripts from Vothun, packed in rows of cots that smelled of disinfectant and old fear. They gave us uniforms that didn't fit, boots that were too large, and loss guns that had clearly been used by several people before us. A drill sergeant named Harrod Brennick spent those 2 weeks turning us into something that could pass for soldiers if you squinted hard enough and didn't look too closely at our trigger discipline. Brennick was a thick-necked man with a voice like a grinding wheel and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. He'd served 12 years and thought that made him immortal. I remember thinking he seemed impossibly old. He was 30. We were designated the Vothun 82nd Line Infantry, folded into the garrison force for the Cassandra campaign, and shipped straight to the front. Cassandra Secundus was a jungle world being torn apart by an orc invasion. I had never seen a tree before in my life. I had never seen a sky that wasn't filtered through hive smog. I had never seen rain that fell in actual drops instead of the recycled condensation drip from the upper HAB levels. And I had certainly never seen an orc, though the screaming from the forward positions on our first night told me more than any briefing ever could about what they were. Our first engagement was on the 4th day. The orcs hit our section of the perimeter at dawn, which was unusual for them. Later, someone told me they preferred to attack at night or midday, when the heat was worst and Imperial soldiers were either sleeping or sluggish. But these orcs, the ones on Cassandra, they were different. They'd been fighting in the jungle for 2 years before we arrived, and they'd learned things. Adapted. That word terrified the officers more than the orcs themselves, because orcs were supposed to be stupid, predictable, manageable in their violence. These weren't. They came out of the tree line in a wave. Not a formation, just a wall of green muscle and rusted iron. The noise was the worst part. Not the shooting, not the war cries, but this constant deep-throated roar, like the sound the furnaces made back on Vothune when the pour was running hot. A sound you felt in your ribs more than heard with your ears. Brennick was shouting orders from somewhere behind me, but I couldn't make out the words over the noise. The man next to me, a conscript from my own Hab level named Pedrin Volk, was firing his loss gun so fast the barrel was glowing cherry red, and I remember thinking he was going to burn it out before the orcs even reached us. They reached us in under a minute. I know that because Brennick had started a countdown from the moment they broke the tree line, shouting the seconds, and he got to 58 before his voice cut off mid-word. I turned and saw the reason. An orc had come through the undergrowth to our left, flanking us, and it had taken Brennick across the chest with something that was half axe and half industrial saw. Brennick was on the ground in 2 pieces, and the orc was already moving on to the next man, which was me. I don't know why it missed. Its swing should have taken my head off. I could feel the displacement of air as the blade passed over me. There was a sensation I couldn't place, not a push, not a pull, but something like a shift in my own center of gravity, as if my body had decided to move before my mind gave the order. I was lower than I should have been, crouching or stumbling or something between the two, and the blade went over my helmet by what felt like a finger's width and buried itself in the plascrete lip of the trench behind me. While the orc was trying to wrench it free, I put my last gun against the side of its skull and pulled the trigger until the power pack clicked empty. The orc fell on top of me, and I spent the next 30 seconds pinned under 200 kilos of dead greenskin, listening to the sounds of everyone else in my squad being killed. When they pulled me out, I was the only one alive. Brennick was dead. Pedrin Volk was dead. The other 9 men in our squad, whose names I had only half learned in the 2 weeks aboard the transport, were dead. I had blood in my eyes and ringing in my ears, and a bruised shoulder from where the orc had landed on me. And that was it. Not a scratch on me that I hadn't given myself. They reassigned me to 2nd Squad, Bravo Platoon, under a corporal named Lorne Vedenach. Vedenach was Kessedra-born, a colonial militia volunteer who'd been folded into the Guard. He had sunburned skin and calm hands, and he showed me how to maintain my lasgun properly, which Brennick had never bothered with. I liked Vedenach. He spoke slowly, like each word had been inspected before he let it out. He told me the jungle would kill more of us than the orcs if we didn't respect it. He told me which insects would lay eggs in your ears while you slept, and which plants would blister your skin if you brushed against them. He told me that the war had been going on for 2 standard years and that the orcs were winning, and that the only thing keeping the Imperial line together was the fact that the Greenskins spent almost as much time fighting each other as they did fighting us. Vedenach lasted 3 weeks. We were on a patrol, moving through a section of jungle that had been marked as cleared 2 days prior. It wasn't cleared. Nothing on Kessedra ever stayed cleared. The orcs had moved back in during the night, setting up one of their crude ambush positions in the canopy. We walked into it without knowing. The first sign was the sound of something heavy dropping through the branches above us, and then a crude frag device went off in the middle of our column, and I was on the ground with dirt in my mouth and the high-pitched whine of a burst eardrum drowning out everything else. When I got to my hands and knees, I saw Vedenach lying 3 meters away. The blast had shredded his left side. He was looking at me with this expression that wasn't fear or pain, but something worse, something like surprise, as if he hadn't quite understood what had happened to him yet. He opened his mouth and blood came out instead of words. I crawled over to him and grabbed his hand, and his fingers tightened on mine once, and then went slack. The rest of the patrol was dead. 8 men. I had a ringing ear and a cut on my forehead from a piece of shrapnel that had missed my eye by a centimeter. That was the 2nd time. The 3rd time was 2 months later, during a full-scale assault on an orc fortification that the commanders had designated Strongpoint Kellic. 3 platoons went in. The orcs had dug themselves into a network of tunnels beneath the ruins of a colonial processing facility, and when our forces breached the perimeter, they triggered some kind of chain-linked explosive system that collapsed the entire western section of the complex. I was in the eastern section. Everyone in the western section died, including my entire squad, except me, because I had been sent back to the supply point to collect additional power packs 60 seconds before the charges went off. 60 seconds. The corporal had pointed at me and said, "Go get the packs, Ressik," and 60 seconds later he and everyone else were buried under 1,000 tons of ferrocrete. That was when people started talking. Not to my face, not at first, but I could feel it in the way they looked at me. The way conversations went quiet when I approached. The way men in the mess would shift seats to put distance between us. 3 engagements, 3 squad wipes, 1 survivor every time. The same survivor. On Vothune, in the foundry stacks, there was a word for a piece of metal that refused to melt no matter how hot the furnace ran. They called it ghost iron. Impurity in the alloy, some flaw in the molecular structure that made it resist the heat that consumed everything around it. The men started calling me that. Ghost iron. Ressik, the ghost iron. The one who wouldn't melt. I was reassigned again, this time to a heavy weapons team attached to the Casadra Garrison's reserve battalion. They put me on an autocannon crew with 3 other men, 2 of whom refused to speak to me, and the third a Casadra colonist named Brennick Cull, who addressed the situation directly. He sat down across from me in the dugout on my first night and said plainly that he didn't believe in curses, but he did believe in statistics, and that the statistics around me were ugly. He said he intended to survive the war and go back to his wife, and that if I did anything at all that put him at risk, he would shoot me himself before the orcs got the chance. I told him I understood. He nodded once and never mentioned it again. We got along after that. Brennick was a practical man. I respected that. Brennick Cull died 7 weeks later when a deaf dread tore through our firing position and crushed the autocannon emplacement with him still strapped into the loader's harness. I was 10 meters away, retrieving a jammed feed belt from the secondary position. I heard the metal scream and turned in time to see the deaf dread grinding what was left of the emplacement into the mud, and Brennick with it. The other 2 crew members had been killed seconds earlier by the orc infantry screening the dread's advance. I picked up a crack grenade from a dead man's webbing, waited for the dread to turn its back, and put the grenade into the gap between its torso plates and the hydraulic assembly at its hip. It went down. I walked back to our lines covered in hydraulic fluid and Brennick's blood. Nobody congratulated me. Nobody said a word. By the end of my first year on Casadra Secundus, I had been reassigned 6 times. I had survived engagements that killed everyone around me on each occasion. The Departamento Munitorum liaison attached to our regiment made a note in his report that was later entered into my service record, a dry little notation that said, "Guardsman Ressik, C demonstrates unusual survivability metrics inconsistent with unit attrition rates. Recommend further monitoring." That note would follow me for the next 49 years. It would be the first thread in a rope that eventually pulled an Inquisitor across half the segmentum to stand in front of me and ask a question I still couldn't answer. Casadra Secundus fell 6 months after that notation was filed. Not to the orcs, but to the decision of someone far above our pay grade that the world wasn't worth holding. The evacuation was a controlled retreat, which is the Munitorum's way of saying an uncontrolled route that happens to have paperwork attached. I made it onto one of the last transports out. Most of the 82nd didn't. Of the 800 men who had shipped out from Vothune Tertius, 37 made it off Casadra. I was one of them. The regiment was officially dissolved, its remnants folded into the Warhammer 40K, a unit from a neighboring system that was being reconstituted after taking heavy losses in a different campaign. New uniform, new officers, same war. The Warhammer 14th deployed to Anthrace 7, a hive world that was dealing with a cultist insurrection in its primary hive cluster. After jungle warfare against orcs, fighting humans in hab corridors and transit tunnels should have felt manageable. It didn't. The cultists on Anthrace were organized, well-armed, and driven by a fervor that made the mindless aggression seem almost reasonable by comparison. They had infiltrated the Hive's infrastructure systems, which meant they could open and close bulkheads at will, vent sections to vacuum, flood corridors with industrial effluent, and generally turn the architecture itself into a weapon. Every advance was a trap. Every cleared section was a future ambush point. The 14th lost 400 men in the first month. I lost 3 more squads. The details blur together. A corridor collapsed that killed 6 men and left me standing in a pocket of air created by a fallen support beam. A booby-trapped hab block that detonated while my unit was clearing it, the blast channeled by the narrow corridors into a pressure wave that liquefied the organs of everyone within 20 meters of the charge, except me, because I had stepped into a side room to check a noise that turned out to be a leaking pipe. A sniper in the upper galleries who killed our sergeant, our Vox operator, and 2 riflemen with 4 precisely placed shots before I even knew we were being targeted. Each shot passing within a handspan of where I was standing, each one finding a different body. Every time, the same result. Everyone dead. Ressik alive. Not unscathed, not always. I collected wounds, lace burns on my arms, shrapnel scars on my legs, a chunk missing from my left ear where a round had clipped me during a firefight in the lower transit hub. But never the killing blow, never the shot that put me down and kept me down. Always a graze, always a near miss, always something that should have killed me but decided, at the last possible fraction of a second, to kill the man next to me instead. On Anthrace 7, the whispers became louder, not just among the rank and file, but among the officers. I heard a lieutenant say to our company commander, in what he thought was a private conversation in the command bunker, that Ressik was either blessed by the Emperor or marked by something else, and either way he wanted me out of his platoon. The company commander, a woman named Captain Esrin Duel, called me into her dugout the next day and asked me directly whether I had any explanation for my survival record. I told her the truth. I didn't. She looked at me for a long time, and I could see her trying to decide whether I was lying, whether I was hiding something, whether I was dangerous. She must have decided I wasn't, because she kept me in her company for another 3 months. Then a cultist mortar barrage hit our command position during a coordinated assault on the Hive's water reclamation district, and Captain Duel and her entire command staff were killed. I was in the bunker when the shells hit. I should have died with them. The first round came through the ceiling and detonated against the Vox bank on the far wall, and in the fraction of a second between the flash and the blast, I felt that shift again, that sourceless displacement of my own weight, and I was on the floor behind the overturned briefing table with no memory of deciding to move. The second and third rounds collapsed the roof. The briefing table, a solid slab of pressed steel, caught the debris and held it off me, while everyone else in the bunker was crushed. I crawled out through a gap in the rubble and stood in the smoke, and looked at what was left of the command post and understood, in some wordless animal part of my brain, that I had not saved myself. Something had saved me. I buried that understanding immediately, shoved it down below the surface where it couldn't reach me, and went to find the nearest officer to report to. The Anthrace campaign lasted 11 months. When it ended, the cultists burned and the hive half demolished in the process of rooting them out. The Hessavine 14th was down to combat ineffective strength. They merged what was left with a penal battalion that had been sent to reinforce us too late to do any good, and shipped the whole sorry mix to a muster point in the Kiel system for refit and reassignment. I was one of 90 survivors from the 14th. The penal troops looked at us with the dull suspicion of men who assumed everyone around them was either a killer, a thief, or both. And the 14th survivors looked at the penal troops with the bone-deep weariness of soldiers who had been through too much to care about the distinction anymore. We were given a new designation, the Giel Combined 44th, which meant nothing to anyone and was promptly forgotten by everyone except the clerk who stamped the paperwork. I spent 3 months at the muster point, which was the longest I'd gone, without someone trying to kill me since I'd left Fothun. They put us through retraining, assigned new officers, issued replacement equipment. I was given a new Les gun, which was indistinguishable from my old one, except that this one had a hairline crack in the stock that someone had tried to fill with adhesive, and that made a clicking noise when I shouldered it. I asked the quartermaster for a replacement. He told me to file a requisition form. I filed the form. 6 weeks later, I received a response informing me that my request had been logged and would be addressed in the order it was received, with an estimated processing time of 14 to 18 months. I kept the cracked Lus gun. It served me well enough for the next 3 years. Our first deployment as the Kiel 44th was a void action, a space station called Giel's Reach, which served as a monitoring post for the system's outer shipping lanes, had been seized by raiders. Not orcs, not cultists, but actual human pirates who had decided that an Imperial Navy monitoring station would make an excellent base of operations. The Navy wanted the station back, but didn't want to destroy it, which meant a boarding action, which meant sending in the guard because someone had to soak up the casualties, and it certainly wasn't going to be Navy personnel. They loaded us into assault boats and sent us across the void in craft that were older than most of our grandparents and sealed about as well. Void combat is a different kind of horror. In a jungle or a hive, you can run, you can fall back, you can dig in. In a void station, you are in a metal box surrounded by vacuum, and the only directions available to you are forward, backward, and dead. The corridors are narrow, the lighting is poor. Every hatch is a potential choke point, and the enemy knows the layout because they've been living in it, which means every corner is a potential kill zone, and every sealed door is either a shortcut or a trap, and you won't know which until you've already committed. We breached through the station's cargo bay, cutting through the hull with melta charges and pouring through the gap into a compartment that the raiders had filled with jury-rigged obstacles and improvised firing positions. The first squad through the breach lost 4 men in the first 10 seconds. I was in the second squad. We came through firing, stepping over the bodies of the first squad, and pushed the raiders back into the interior corridors. The fighting was close, ugly, personal. Las guns at ranges so short you could see the color of the other man's eyes when you pulled the trigger. Combat knives when the corridors were too narrow to swing a rifle. At one point, I found myself pressed flat against a bulkhead, while a raider on the other side of a half-open hatch fired a stub pistol blindly around the frame, the rounds sparking off the metal centimeters from my face. I waited for his magazine to empty, counted the shots, and when the clicking came, I stepped around the hatch and killed him. He was young, younger than me. He had a tattoo on his neck that I couldn't read in the dim light. I stepped over him and kept moving. We took the station in 8 hours. The 44th lost 60 men. My squad lost all 9. I had a lace burn across my ribs where a shot had grazed me, and a fractured finger from where I'd punched a raider in the face when my gun jammed. That was it. Sergeant Alwyn, who had led the squad, was dead from a shotgun blast that had caught him in the throat as he rounded a corner I had just passed through. Trooper Hal Vene, who had been right behind me during the corridor push, had taken a burst of autogun fire that punched through his flak armor and killed him instantly. The rounds had passed within a hand width of my left arm. I felt them go by. I felt the air move against my sleeve. But they hit Halven, not me. They always hit someone else. That was when I first noticed something I couldn't explain. During the fighting in the central hub of the station, when the raiders had triggered some kind of booby trap that blew out the deck plating and sent a geyser of coolant through the compartment, I remember being on my feet, and then I remember being on the other side of the room. The space between those two moments was blank. Not darkness, not unconsciousness, just nothing. As if someone had cut 2 seconds out of my life with a pair of shears and stitched the remaining edges together. I was here, and then I was there, and in between there was a gap I could not account for. I assumed it was the blast. The concussive force of an explosion can do strange things to memory. I had seen men forget entire hours after a close detonation. 2 seconds was nothing. I told myself it was nothing, and I filed it away in the part of my mind where I kept all the things I didn't want to think about, which was getting crowded. After Gehil's reach, I was transferred again. By this point, my service record was thick enough to draw attention whenever it passed across an officer's desk. Not because of commendations or disciplinary actions, but because of the sheer statistical improbability recorded in its pages. 10 squad wipes across 3 campaigns, 1 survivor every time. The Munitorum liaison's original note had been appended with additional observations from 3 different commanding officers, each one noting in their own carefully bureaucratic way that Guardsman Ressik, C, continued to demonstrate survival patterns inconsistent with projected attrition models. One of them had underlined the word inconsistent. Another had added a handwritten notation in the margin that said, "Refer to Commissariat for assessment." That notation changed things. The Commissariat took an interest. A commissar named Enoch Drave was assigned to evaluate me. Drave was not what I expected. I had known commissars before, the standard issue type, men and women in long black coats who stood behind the firing line with bolt pistols drawn and encouraged steadfastness through the simple mathematics of which direction was more dangerous to run. Drave was different. He was quiet. He was thin. He wore his coat buttoned to the throat even in heat that made the rest of us strip to our undershirts, and he watched everything with the careful attention of a man cataloging evidence. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He asked questions in a soft voice and waited for answers with a patience that was more unsettling than any threat of execution. Drave joined my new unit, the Barathene 9th, which had been assigned to a crusade front in the Barathene subsector. The campaign was a multi-world operation against a chaos warband that had been raiding the subsector's agri-worlds for the better part of a decade, burning crops, slaughtering populations, performing rituals in the ashes. The Barathene Crusade was a massive undertaking involving elements from 6 different guard regiments, 2 Adepta Sororitas Preceptories, and at least 1 company of Astartes from a chapter whose name I was never told. Our role, as always, was to be the blunt instrument, the hammer, the expendable mass that held the line while more valuable assets struck the decisive blows. Drave shadowed me, that's the only word for it. He positioned himself near me during briefings, during meals, during deployments. He watched me fight. He watched me sleep. He took notes in a small leather-bound book that he kept in his breast pocket, writing in a cipher I couldn't read. At first, the other soldiers were nervous about his presence, assuming he was there to enforce discipline or root out cowardice. But as the weeks went on and Drave made no arrests and issued no punishments, they began to understand that his interest was specific. He was watching me. Only me. The Barathene Crusade was the bloodiest campaign I had served in. The Chaos War Band was led by a warlord whose name the Commissariat forbade us from speaking aloud. A former Imperial commander who had turned traitor and brought 3 regiments worth of soldiers with him into damnation. His forces were well-trained, well-equipped, and augmented by things I don't have adequate words for. Mutants, possessed, creatures that wore human shapes poorly, like a coat that didn't quite fit. We fought them across 4 worlds in the span of 2 years, and on each world the pattern held. On Barathene Primus, a fortress world whose defenses had been corrupted from within, my squad was ambushed during a night patrol and wiped out by a kill team of traitor veterans who moved through the dark with a silence that was not entirely natural. I survived because I tripped over a piece of debris at the exact moment the first volley of fire came in, pitching forward into a drainage ditch that ran alongside the patrol route. The rounds passed over me. When I climbed out, everyone else was dead and the traitors had withdrawn into the darkness. Drave, who had been following 50 meters behind, reached me within minutes. He shone a lamp pack into my face and studied my expression, looking for something. I don't know what he expected to see. Guilt, maybe. Relief. Some crack in the surface that would tell him what he wanted to know. Whatever he was looking for, he didn't find it. He made a note in his book and told me to report to the command post. On Barathene Tertius, an agri-world that the enemy had turned into a charnel ground, my platoon was caught in an artillery barrage while crossing an open field. 30 men. The barrage lasted 4 minutes. When it stopped, I was lying in a crater with my ears bleeding and my uniform shredded, and there were body parts scattered across the field in a pattern that would have looked random from above, but wasn't. The shells had landed in a spread that covered every square meter of that field except the one I was lying on. Drave, who had been watching from the tree line, walked out across the field afterward. I saw him measuring distances, counting impact craters, mapping the spread. He spent an hour in that field while the Medici teams collected what was left of the platoon. When he came back, he said nothing to me, but I saw his hand shaking when he put his book back in his pocket. 3 months into the Barathene Crusade, Drave requested a private audience with me. We sat in a bombed-out chapel on Barathene Quintus, just the 2 of us, and he asked me a question no one had ever asked me before. He asked me if I was afraid. I told him the truth. I told him I wasn't. Not because I was brave and not because I was numb, but because at some point over the preceding years, the part of me that understood danger had become disconnected from the part that responded to it. I could see the threat. I could calculate the risk. But the fear that should have followed those calculations never came. It was like watching a fire through a thick pane of glass. You could see the flames, feel a distant warmth, but the heat that should have blistered your skin simply never arrived. Drave listened to this without expression. Then he told me something that changed the shape of my understanding. He had been reviewing my service record in detail, cross-referencing it with the records of every unit I had been assigned to, every engagement I had survived. The pattern was not merely statistical, it was geometric. The deaths around me did not follow the random distribution of combat casualties. They followed a pattern, a shape, like the blast radius of a detonation with me at its center. The closer someone was to me, the more likely they were to die. The further away, the safer they became. He had mapped it, engagement by engagement. There was a kill radius around me, approximately 15 meters, within which the mortality rate for everyone except me was functionally 100%, and beyond which it dropped to normal combat attrition levels. He had never seen anything like it. He didn't know what it meant. But he was afraid of me, and before submitting a formal report recommending Inquisitorial investigation, he intended to confirm his findings himself. I asked him what that meant. In the next engagement, he was going to enter the kill radius, deliberately. Position himself within 15 meters of me during active combat and observe what happened. I told him that his own data suggested this would kill him. He was aware of that. That awareness was the point. A pattern observed from the outside was theory. A pattern experienced from the inside was evidence. Then he stood up, put on his peaked cap, and walked out of the chapel. That was the last real conversation I ever had with Enoch Drave. He died 11 days later. We were assaulting a fortified position on the southern continent of Barathene Quintus, a supply depot that the traitors had converted into a ritual site. Drave started the assault where he always did, 200 meters behind the front line, well outside the boundary he'd drawn on his charts. I could see him through the smoke, a thin figure in a black coat, standing still while the world burned around him. And then, when the breach was made and my squad pushed inside, he began to walk forward. I watched him do it, watched him cross the 200 meters in steady, measured paces, his bolt pistol in one hand and his data book in the other, dictating observations into the micro-recorder he wore on a chain beneath his collar. He passed the 100-meter line, the 50-meter line. The men around me were fighting, dying, pushing deeper into the depot, and Drave was walking toward me through all of it with the focused calm of a man conducting a controlled experiment. He reached the 15-meter boundary during a lull in the fighting, when the traitors had pulled back to an inner defensive ring, and we were consolidating our breach. He stopped. He stood there 15 meters from me, and he waited. The counterattack came less than a minute later. The traitors poured out of the inner ring, supported by mutants that had been held in reserve. The fighting was savage and close. I lost track of Drave in the chaos, but I heard later what happened. A mutant had crawled through the drainage system beneath the depot and come up through a grate directly behind where Drave was standing. It found him with his recorder running, still speaking into it, still noting what he observed. The mutant killed him with its hands. They told me it took some time, but the recorder survived. It was commissariat issue, armored, built to outlast the man wearing it and preserve his final orders. His coat was torn to pieces, his body was barely recognizable, but the small device under his collar kept its data. That recording, those last whispered observations of a dying man confirming his own hypothesis from inside the kill radius he'd mapped, eventually found its way into the Inquisitorial archives where someone would retrieve it years later. The Barathene crusade ground on for another 14 months after Drave's death, chewing through men and materiel at a rate that left the administratum clerks visibly distressed, and I survived all of it. Every engagement, every assault, every last stand. New squads were formed around me and destroyed. Officers who commanded me were killed. Soldiers who slept in the cot next to mine didn't wake up. The pattern held, relentless and absolute, and by the time the crusade was declared a victory and the surviving regiments were pulled back for reconstitution, my reputation had spread beyond the unit. They started calling me other things. Not just Ghost Iron, the Curse, the Last Man, the Hollow. One regiment, the Palisade 3rd, refused to accept me when the Munitorum tried to transfer me into their ranks. Their colonel, a veteran named Esken Moore, filed a formal objection stating that Guardsman Ressik's documented history constituted a material threat to unit cohesion and combat effectiveness, and that integrating him into the Palisade Third would be tantamount to sabotage. The Munitorum overruled the objection, as it always does, because manpower quotas don't care about superstition or statistics. Colonel Moore accepted me into his regiment with visible reluctance. He assigned me to a specialist reconnaissance squad that operated ahead of the main force, alone or in pairs, which I understood to be both practical and personal. If I was going to get people killed, at least this way I'd only get 1 or 2 at a time instead of whole platoons. Reconnaissance suited me. For the first time in my career, I was operating in small numbers, often alone, scouting terrain and reporting back. I was good at it. Not because I was stealthy or particularly skilled in fieldcraft, but because the skills I developed on Vothun, the ability to read terrain, to judge distances, to notice the small details that others missed, translated well to reconnaissance work. I could tell when a ridgeline was being watched by the way the light fell differently on the stones where someone had displaced them. I could tell when a position had been recently occupied by the smell of bodies and spent power cells, and the particular flattening of vegetation that boots make when they stay in one place for too long. And I kept surviving, though in reconnaissance the survivals were less dramatic. No squad wipes, no impossible near misses. Just solo patrols that went out and came back, uneventfully, while the patrols in other sectors ran into ambushes and minefields and the 100 other ways a war zone can kill you. Colonel Moore kept me in reconnaissance for 2 years. During that time, 12 other reconnaissance operators were killed. I was not among them. Moore never spoke to me directly. He communicated through intermediaries, issued my orders through a junior lieutenant who seemed embarrassed to be the go-between. When the Palisade Third was finally rotated off the front line, Moore transferred me out of his regiment with a service record notation that said, simply, unfit for standard unit integration. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. I don't want to give the impression that my life was nothing but combat and death. There were intervals, long stretches of transit between war zones, weeks spent in the holds of troop ships where the only enemy was boredom and the only casualty was whatever patience you had left. Garrison postings on quiet worlds where the most dangerous thing was the local wildlife or the quality of the rations. Periods of reconstitution where shattered units were rebuilt around whatever survivors remained, and you spent your days drilling and maintaining equipment and trying not to think about the men who used to stand in the positions now occupied by replacements who looked too young and too clean and too alive. These intervals were the Imperium's way of sharpening its tools between uses. They were not rest. They were maintenance. During these intervals, I did what soldiers have always done. I maintained my kit. I exercised, running circuits of whatever perimeter we were camped inside, keeping my aging body functional through sheer repetitive effort. I wrote no letters because there was no one to write to. My mother was dead, or if she wasn't, I had no way of knowing and no address to send a letter. I had no friends, no family, no connections to anything outside the regiment I was currently attached to. I existed in a permanent present tense, a man without a past he wanted to remember or a future he expected to reach. Sometimes, during the quiet hours before dawn when the camp was still and the sentries were shadows against the perimeter wire, I would sit outside my billet and look at whatever sky happened to be above me. Each world had its own sky, its own arrangement of stars, its own particular quality of darkness. They were never the same sky I had grown up under, the brownish haze of Vothune that never fully cleared. But they were skies, and they were quiet, and in those moments the gap felt very far away. I spent the next 5 years being passed from regiment to regiment like a malfunctioning component that nobody wanted to repair and nobody was willing to scrap. The Munitorum kept assigning me because I was a warm body with a service record and they had quotas to fill. The regiments kept getting rid of me because the stories traveled faster than the paperwork. By the time I arrived at a new unit, the men already knew who I was. Ghost Iron, the Curse, the man whose shadow killed everyone it touched. Some commanders tried to use me as they would a weapon, putting me in the most dangerous positions in the hope that whatever kept me alive would extend to the men around me. It didn't. Others stuck me in rear echelon roles, where I couldn't do any damage. But the rear echelon has a habit of becoming the front line when things go wrong, and things always went wrong. Every time, the same result. The men near me died. I didn't. I stopped learning names. Not deliberately, not at first. It happened the way calluses happen, gradually, through repetition. You shake a man's hand, you hear his name, and the part of your mind that should store it simply refuses, because it has stored too many names that now belong to corpses, and the weight of them is more than it can carry. I started thinking of people by function instead. The gunner, the driver, the medic, the one who talks too much, the one who prays before every engagement, the one who keeps a picture of his children tucked inside his helmet liner. I could describe them in detail. I just couldn't remember what to call them. After the 7th reassignment in 3 years, the Munitorum made a decision that surprised me. They sent me to a penal legion. Not as punishment because I had committed no crime, but because the notation in my record, unfit for standard unit integration, had been interpreted by some clerk as a behavioral flag, and the standing protocol for soldiers with behavioral flags who couldn't be discharged was assignment to a penal unit where their inevitable death would at least serve a purpose. The irony of sending me, a man who could not dim, to a unit designed to kill its members was apparently lost on the clerk in question. Or perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps someone, somewhere in the labyrinthine guts of the Departamento Munitorum, was conducting an experiment, sending the unkillable man to the place where everyone dies. I never found out. The penal unit was designated the 19th Redemption Battalion, attached to the Calvaride Garrison Force. Calvaride was a death world, a planet whose entire biosphere seemed to have evolved with the singular purpose of killing anything, with the audacity to exist on its surface. The atmosphere was breathable but thick, humid, laden with particulates that gummed up weapon mechanisms and coated your lungs with a film that made every breath feel like you were inhaling through a wet cloth. The vegetation was aggressive in a way that went beyond the usual dangers of a jungle world. On Kessadra, the plants had been passive threats, things you could avoid if you knew what to look for. On Calvaride, the plants hunted. Vine-like organisms would drop from the canopy and wrap around anything warm-blooded, constricting with a strength that could crack flak armor. Fungal growths released clouds of spores that paralyzed the nervous system within seconds of inhalation. The ground itself was unreliable, thin crusts of dried organic matter over pits of decomposing biomass that could swallow a man whole and digest him over the course of several days. It was the kind of world that made you appreciate the simple honesty of a bullet. We were sent to Calvaride because something worse than the planet had arrived. A Tyranid splinter fleet, a tendril broken off from a larger hive fleet that had passed through the sector decades earlier, had made planetfall and was consuming the world's biomass at an accelerating rate. The Imperial Garrison, a small force of planetary defense troops and a single guard regiment, was being overwhelmed. The 19th Redemption Battalion was sent as reinforcement, which is a generous way of describing what we were. We were ablative armor, a wall of expendable flesh thrown in front of the swarm to buy time for the evacuation of the planet's tiny colonial population. No one expected us to survive. That was the point. The warden lieutenant in charge of the 19th was a man named Cosin Drawl, and he was the first officer I'd served under who treated the penal troops as something other than refuse. Drawl was career commissariat, a man who had chosen penal oversight because he believed, genuinely and without apparent irony, that redemption was possible even for the worst of the Imperium's condemned. He addressed us by rank, maintained discipline through structure rather than fear, and led from the front in a way that made the penal troops follow him out of something that resembled loyalty, rather than the simple terror of the commissar's bolt pistol. He was a good man. Good men don't last long in penal legions, and they last even less long on death worlds fighting tyrannids. The night before we deployed to our first forward position, a woman named Varadne Kos sat down next to me in the barracks. She was a former manufactorum worker from somewhere in the Segmentum Solar, condemned for beating her shift overseer to death with a spanner after he crippled her younger brother over a missed quota. She was small, wiry, with hands that were calloused in a way that reminded me of my own, and she had the particular stillness of a person who had already accepted the worst thing that was ever going to happen to them. She knew who I was. Everyone in the 19th knew. But she sat down beside me anyway, and when I told her that people who stayed near me tended to die, she said that everyone in the 19th tended to die, and at least I was quiet about it. We sat in silence after that, listening to the sounds of the barracks and the alien jungle beyond the walls, and it was the closest thing to companionship I had experienced in years. She didn't ask me about the curse. She didn't ask me about anything. She just sat there, close enough that I could hear her breathing, and for a few hours the weight of being Ressik the Ghost Iron was a fraction lighter than it had been. The tyrannids on Calvaride were unlike anything I had faced. I had fought orcs, who were brutal but comprehensible. I had fought cultists, who were human and therefore predictable in their unpredictability. I had fought traitors, who fought like we did because they had once been us. But the tyrannids were something else entirely. They didn't think. They didn't feel. They didn't hate or fear or strategize in any way I could understand. They were appetite given form, a hunger that moved through the jungle in waves of chitin and claw and acid, and they killed not out of malice but out of biological necessity, the way a furnace consumes fuel. There was nothing personal in it. That made it worse. Our first engagement was at a colonial outpost called Station Venick, a small agri-processing facility that had been overrun 3 days before our arrival. Drawl sent us in to assess the situation and recover any survivors. There were no survivors. There was barely a station. The tyrannids had stripped the facility down to its foundations, consuming the building materials, the equipment, the stored food, and the people with equal and indiscriminate thoroughness. All that remained were the ferrocrete pilings, too dense for the bioforms to digest, standing in rows like the teeth of some enormous jaw. The bodies of the colonists were gone, consumed entirely. Not even bones remained. We set up a defensive perimeter around what was left of Station Venick and waited. We didn't wait long. The swarm hit us at dusk, emerging from the jungle in a wave of small, fast bioforms, the kind they call hormagaunts, though I didn't learn the proper name until later. At the time, they were just claws and teeth and speed, pouring out of the undergrowth in numbers that made counting impossible and formation irrelevant. We fired into the mass and killed dozens, hundreds, and it didn't matter because there were always more. The swarm didn't attack in lines or waves. It flowed like liquid, finding the gaps in our perimeter and pouring through them, surrounding individual soldiers and tearing them apart with a mechanical efficiency that left no room for heroism or last stands. Varadne Kos was 3 meters from me when the Hormagaunt took her. 3 meters. Well within the radius. I saw it hit her, saw the claw punch through her throat, saw her go down with the creature on top of her. I felt the familiar shift, the gap trying to open, pulling me sideways towards safety, while the woman who had given me an evening of silence was being torn apart close enough to touch. I killed the Hormagaunt. I killed the one behind it. It didn't matter. She was already gone. The penal troops broke. Not all of them, not immediately, but enough. Men who had faced down Habgangers, Arbitas, even other soldiers in the crimes that had earned them their place in the 19th, screamed and ran when the Tyranids came close enough to touch. Drall shot 2 of them himself, standing in the breach with his bolt pistol barking and his face set in an expression of grim focus. He rallied the line, held it. For 10 minutes, he held it through sheer force of will, until a warrior form, one of the larger Tyranid bioforms with scything talons as long as my arm, vaulted over the barricade and landed behind our line. It killed 3 men before anyone could react. Drall turned to face it, and I saw the moment of recognition cross his face, the understanding that this was not something a bolt pistol could stop. He fired anyway. The rounds punched into the warrior's carapace and did nothing. The creature took his head off with a single lateral sweep of its talon, and Drall's body stood upright for a full second, blood fountaining from the stump of his neck before it collapsed. I should have died in that engagement. The warrior form was less than 4 meters from me when it killed Drall. Its next strike should have been at me. I was the nearest living thing. But between Drall falling and the creature's next movement, there was a gap. A stutter. A fraction of a second where I was somewhere else, where my awareness blinked out like a faulty lumen strip and came back an instant later with me 2 meters to the left, behind a pile of debris that hadn't been there before, or that I hadn't noticed before, or that I had somehow reached without the intervening steps of getting there. The warrior form struck the space where I had been standing and hit empty air, and in the half-second of its recovery, I jammed my last gun against the softer tissue beneath its jaw and emptied the power pack into its skull. It died. I didn't. The engagement lasted another 40 minutes before the swarm withdrew, not because we defeated it, but because it had consumed enough biomass from our dead to trigger whatever biological process directed it to the next feeding site. Of the 120 men in the 19th Redemption Battalion, 17 survived. I was one of them. Drall was not. The other 16 survivors looked at me with an expression I had seen many times before, that mixture of awe and fear, and something that might have been hatred if they'd had the energy for it. But it was the gap that stayed with me, that blank space between one moment and the next, the instant of not being there that had saved my life. It had happened before on Gil's Reach. I had dismissed it then. I couldn't dismiss it now. Twice was a coincidence. But I was starting to suspect it had happened more than twice. I was starting to suspect it happened every time, in every engagement, in every impossible survival, and that I simply hadn't noticed because the gap was so small, so brief, that it was indistinguishable from the fog of combat, unless you were specifically looking for it. And until now, I hadn't been looking. We were evacuated from Calvaride along with the remnants of the colonial population. The Tyranids consumed the rest of the world within 6 months. The 19th Redemption Battalion was disbanded, its survivors integrated into whatever unit needed bodies, and I was back in the Munitorum's processing queue, a problem no one wanted to solve. By this point, my service record was over 40 pages long and contained enough anomalous entries to give a statistician nightmares. Someone, somewhere, was going to notice. Someone already had. She arrived without warning, which I later learned was typical of her kind. Interrogator Merthin Udo of the Ordo Hereticus. She came aboard the transport ship that was carrying me and the other Calvaride survivors to our next assignment, accompanied by 2 armed retainers and a servo skull that followed her everywhere and recorded everything with a single red-lit optical lens. Udo was a small woman with dark hair cut short and eyes that assessed everything they looked at with a cold precision that reminded me of the administratum data clerks on Vothun, except the clerks had been cataloging slag yields and Udo was cataloging threats. She wore a long coat of dark leather over carapace armor, and she carried a plasma pistol on her hip that looked old enough to be an heirloom. She summoned me to the ship's interrogation chamber, which was a small room with a metal table, 2 chairs, and overhead lighting bright enough to make me squint. She sat across from me and placed a data slate on the table between us. It contained my service record. She had annotated it extensively, with sections highlighted in red and notes written in a sharp, angular hand. Udo spent 3 hours asking me questions. Where was I born? Who were my parents? Had I ever been exposed to Xenos artifacts? Had I ever experienced visions, voices, intrusive thoughts? Had I ever been tested for psychic potential? Had I ever knowingly or unknowingly participated in rituals, ceremonies, or practices not sanctioned by the ecclesiarchy? Had I ever felt compelled to do things without understanding why? The questions were clinical, precise, and revealed nothing about what she was looking for or what she already knew. I answered everything. I had nothing to hide, or at least I believed I had nothing to hide, and lying to an interrogator of the Ordo Hereticus struck me as a faster path to death than anything the Tyranids had offered. I told her about Vothun, about the slag raking, about the tithing. I told her about Cassandra and Anthrace, and Giel's Reach, and the Barathine Crusade and Calvaride. I told her about the squads that died and the men who wouldn't serve with me, and the commissar who had mapped the kill radius around me and then died himself. I told her about the gaps, the moments of blankness that occurred at the exact instant when death was closest. I told her everything I had told no one else, because some part of me hoped she would be able to explain it. That she would tell me what I was. That she would name the thing that was wrong with me, and in naming it, make it something I could understand. Udo listened to all of this without expression. When I finished, she closed the data slate, placed it in her coat pocket, and looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then she said something that I have thought about every day since. She said that in 20 years of service to the Ordo Hereticus, she had investigated witches, heretics, mutants, possessed, demon hosts, and things that defied classification. Every one of them had shown some trace of abnormality under examination, some sign, however faint, that something was wrong. A psychic signature, a genetic deviation, a moral corruption visible in the pattern of their choices. I showed none of these things. My psychic profile was flat, a baseline human with no more warp presence than a piece of furniture. My genetic structure was standard hive world stock, with no mutations or deviations. My service record, while statistically impossible, showed no pattern of deliberate action that could be attributed to malice, corruption, or hidden agenda. By every metric available to her, I was a completely ordinary man who had no business being alive. Then she paused. She had been clinical throughout the entire interview, precise and detached, but in that pause something shifted behind her eyes. "One more thing," she said. In her experience, the anomalies that defeated every test were never the ones that came from outside. They were the ones that had been there from the beginning. Before the first breath, before the first heartbeat. Things so old, so fundamental to the subject's existence, that they didn't register as foreign because they had never been absent. She didn't know what that meant in my case. It was an observation, not a conclusion. I didn't understand what she meant. I wouldn't understand for decades. Then she left. She told me that she would be filing a report with her Inquisitor and that I should continue my duties until further notice. I asked her, before she went, why she was letting me go. If she thought I was carrying something, why not detain me? She looked at me with that flat, measuring stare and said that suspicion was not evidence. Her servo skull had scanned me through every minute of the interrogation, every bio reading and aura spectrum it was built to take, and all of it had come back clean. She could not requisition a man out of the guard and into a cell on the strength of a feeling, not without authority above her own, and the things she would need to prove first did not leave proof. Detaining me would require her Inquisitor's sanction, and her Inquisitor would require what she did not have, so I would keep serving, and she would keep watching, and one of those two things would eventually produce something she could act on. She gave no indication of what the report would recommend. Her servo skull's red eye watched me for a moment longer than she did, and then they were both gone, the door closing behind them with a sound that felt like a verdict postponed. I waited for the verdict to come. It didn't. Weeks passed. Months. I was assigned to a new unit, folded into another regiment from another world I'd never heard of, and the war continued as it always did. I fought. Men around me died. I survived. The gaps kept happening, those blank stutters in the middle of firefights and bombardments, where I went from one place to another without the intervening journey. I started paying attention to them, trying to catch them in the act, to stay conscious through the transition. I never could. One moment I was here, the next I was somewhere else, and the space where I had been standing was occupied by a bullet or a piece of shrapnel or the swinging blade of something that wanted me dead. 3 years after Udo's visit, I learned that she was dead, killed during an operation on a shrine world in the segmentum obscurus. The details were classified. Whether she had filed her report about me and whether anyone had read it, I didn't know. Her death felt like the closing of a door, the last person who had been actively trying to understand what I was. Gone. I was alone with the mystery of myself, and I had stopped expecting answers. I was wrong about that. But the wrongness was slow in revealing itself, and in the years that followed, I simply kept doing what I had always done. I fought. I survived. I buried no one, because there was never time and rarely anyone left who cared enough to dig. The units changed around me like scenery viewed through the slit of a moving transport. Remnants of shattered regiments merged with other remnants, temporary formations held together by spit and stubbornness, and the fact that the Munitorum had nowhere else to put us. Each time, the same pattern. I would arrive. The men would learn who I was. Some would try to transfer out. Those who stayed would die in the next engagement, or the one after that, or the one after that. I would survive, and the gap would happen. That stuttering blank in my awareness, that fraction of a second, where I went from one place to another without the steps between, and each time it happened I was a little more aware of it, a little more certain that it was not the fog of combat or the tricks of an overstressed mind, but something else, something deliberate, something that moved me like a hand moving a piece on a regicide board. On a world called Severn, during a night assault on an enemy-held ridgeline, I experienced the longest gap I had ever felt. We were advancing up a slope under heavy fire, the tracer rounds cutting lines of light through the darkness above our heads, and a mortar shell came in on my position. I heard the whistle. I knew the way you learn to know after decades of experience that it was going to land within 2 meters of me. I knew I was going to die. And then I was 40 meters downhill, face down in a drainage culvert, with no memory of how I had gotten there. The shell had detonated exactly where I had been standing. 3 men who had been advancing alongside me were dead. I was lying in a ditch with mud in my mouth, and the afterimage of a gap that had lasted, by my best estimate, nearly 4 seconds. 4 seconds of non-existence. 4 seconds during which something had picked me up and placed me somewhere else. I lay in that ditch and felt my hands shaking and understood for the first time that I was not merely lucky, not merely blessed, not merely the beneficiary of statistical improbability. Something was actively keeping me alive, something that lived in those missing seconds and moved through them, the way I moved through air. I stopped sleeping well after that. Not from nightmares, but from the awareness that the gap could happen at any time, that even in sleep I was not entirely myself, that there was a tenant in the space behind my eyes whose presence I could feel the way you feel the vibration of machinery through a deck plate, too faint to identify, too persistent to ignore. I developed habits, small ones, practical ones, the kind of adaptations that long-service soldiers make without thinking about it. I kept my boots on when I slept. I kept my las gun within arm's reach at all times, not because I feared attack, but because the weight of it against my hand was a tether, a reminder that I was here, in this body, in this moment, and not wherever the gap took me when it opened. I ate alone because no one wanted to sit with me, and because I no longer wanted to learn the names of men who would be dead within the month. I spoke only when spoken to, and what I said was brief and functional, stripped of the small talk and complaint that constitute the social currency of soldiers in a war zone. I became furniture, a piece of equipment that happened to have a heartbeat. The officers learned to use me the way you use a tool, whose function is reliable even if its mechanism is poorly understood. Point it at the enemy and let it do its work. My body, meanwhile, was beginning to show the accumulated cost of 50 years of service. Not dramatically. The juvenile treatments that the Imperium reserved for officers and nobility were not available to guardsmen, and I aged the way any man ages, 1 year at a time, each one adding a little more stiffness to the joints, a little more gray to the hair, a little more distance between the body's intention and its execution. My hands, which had once been quick enough to field strip a lasgun in under 30 seconds, now took twice that. My knees ached in cold weather. My left ear, the one damaged in the Anthrace campaign, had deteriorated to the point where I could hear almost nothing through it, reducing the world to a lopsided soundscape where everything came from the right. The scars I had accumulated over the decades pulled and itched when the temperature changed, a constellation of old wounds that mapped my history on my skin. I was 68 years old. In a hive, that would have made me elderly. In the Guard, it made me a relic. I fought on 6 more worlds during those years, most blurred together, but one stayed sharp. On Vandrek Majoris, an industrial world being raided by Dark Eldar, I lost a squad to an ambush so fast I didn't even have time to unsling my weapon before they were dead. The Xenos came out of nowhere, literally nowhere, stepping through the air itself like they were passing through a doorway I couldn't see, and they killed 7 men in the time it took me to blink. When they turned toward me, one of them hesitated. I saw it happen. The Xenos, this impossibly fast, impossibly graceful thing with a blade that hummed with a light I could feel in my teeth, paused, its head tilted like a predator encountering something it didn't recognize. It looked at me for perhaps half a second, and in that half second its companion, The one flanking me from the right was hit by a burst of lass fire from a relief patrol that had heard the shooting and come running. They fired from the far end of the street, a good 40 meters off, well back from whatever it was that killed everyone close to me. The surviving Xenos withdrew. They took their dead with them, as they always do. But the one that had hesitated left behind a smear of dark blood on the rock crete where the last bolt had clipped it. The patrol's corporal asked me later what had happened, why the Xenos had broken off. I told him the relief fire had driven them away. I didn't tell him about the hesitation. I didn't tell him that something in the way that Dark Eldar had looked at me suggested it hadn't been afraid exactly, but had seen something it recognized, something it had encountered before, something that made it reassess whether I was prey or something else entirely. Later, the platoon's medici examined that blood sample as part of standard Xenos contamination protocol. He told me the results showed nothing abnormal. But when he said it, he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the wall behind my head, the way people do when they're saying something they don't entirely believe. The Dark Eldar encounter disturbed me in a way the other battles hadn't. Not because of the Xenos themselves, though they were horrible enough, but because of that moment of hesitation. That fraction of a second where the Xenos had looked at me and stopped. These were creatures that didn't hesitate. Hesitation was not in their nature. They were predators refined by millennia of cruelty into something that acted on instinct and desire without the impediment of doubt. And yet, this one had paused. It had seen something that made it reconsider. I didn't know what it had seen, but the fact that a Dark Eldar raider found it noteworthy was not reassuring. I tried not to think about it. I was good at not thinking about things by then. 40 years of practice. You learn to partition your mind the way you partition a supply crate, keeping the useful items accessible and the rest packed away where they won't interfere. The useful items were simple. Maintain the weapon, eat when food is available, sleep when sleep is possible, follow orders, stay alive. The packed-away items were everything else. The gaps, the hesitation of the Dark Eldar, the kill radius that Commissar Drave had mapped before he died, the look on interrogator Udo's face when she told me I was completely ordinary. All of it, packed tight, sealed shut, labeled "Do Not Open." By the time I reached my 50th year of service, I was the oldest enlisted guardsman in the entire Drenavar campaign force. Drenavar was a border world, a place that existed primarily to be fought over by whoever happened to want it at the time. When we arrived, it was being contested by a chaos warband that had spilled out of the Great Rift and set up a forward operating base in the ruins of the planet's former capital. The campaign was routine by the standards of the era. Establish a perimeter, push inland, locate and destroy the enemy stronghold, repeat until the planet was either liberated or deemed too costly to hold. I had done it a dozen times before. The officers were new. The enemy was new. The planet was new. The war was the same. I was assigned to the Drossengrav 100th, my 9th regiment, which I had been with for the past 6 years. The longest I'd stayed with any single unit. Not because the dying had stopped, but because the 100th was large enough to absorb casualties without needing to transfer me out, and because their commanding officer, Colonel Essavine Prone, had adopted a policy of simply keeping me away from the main body of the regiment. I was attached to the long-range scout detachment, operating in pairs or alone, charting enemy positions and movement patterns. The same role Colonel Moore had put me in years before, far from the lines, far from the other soldiers, far from the kill radius. It was the closest thing to peace I had experienced since leaving Vothun. The scout work on Drenavar suited the man I had become. I would go out before dawn, moving through the shattered landscape of what had once been a moderately prosperous border colony, mapping the positions of the enemy warbands that still held the northern districts. The terrain was a mixture of ruined urban sprawl and open steppe, buildings reduced to skeletal frameworks by years of orbital bombardment, interspersed with stretches of dry grassland that waved in a perpetual wind, carrying the taste of ash and old chemical fire. I learned the landscape the way I had once learned the slag beds on Vothun, by feel and instinct, reading the ground for signs of recent movement, tracking boot prints and vehicle ruts, noting where the vegetation had been crushed or burned by passing forces. I carried a magnocular, a long-range Vox set, a water canteen, my Lasgon, and nothing else. I needed nothing else. The simplicity of it was the closest thing to contentment I had felt in decades. When I returned to base, I filed my reports, ate alone, maintained my equipment, and slept. The other soldiers in the camp knew who I was. They always knew. But by this point in my career, the knowledge had become less a source of fear and more a kind of uneasy mythology. The younger troops, the ones who had only been fighting for 5 or 10 years, treated me with the cautious deference you might show to an unexploded ordnance. Not hostile, but not something you wanted to get close to either. The veterans, the ones who had been in long enough to know that the universe operated on rules that didn't always make sense, simply gave me space. There was an unspoken agreement in the camp that Ressik was best left alone, and I was grateful for it. That peace ended on a day that began like any other. I was in the field kitchen at our forward operating base, eating a meal of rehydrated protein and something that was optimistically labeled vegetable supplement, when the camp's Vox network lit up with a priority transmission. An unregistered vessel had entered Drenavar's orbit. Not Chaos, not Navy, something else. A vessel bearing the Inquisitorial seal. The camp went quiet, not the quiet of discipline or attention, but the quiet of fear. Everyone in the Imperial Guard knows what the Inquisitorial seal means. It means someone has drawn attention that should not be drawn. It means questions that have no good answers. It means the possibility of things worse than combat, worse than death, because at least in combat the rules are clear. You fight, you die, you're done. With the Inquisition, the rules are whatever the Inquisitor decides they are, and the dying comes when and how they choose. I put down my meal. I didn't need to ask who they were coming for. I had been waiting for this moment for years, the way you wait for a sound you know is coming but can't predict. The creak of metal before a furnace wall gives way, the particular whistle of an incoming shell. You hear it in your sleep, you hear it in the silences between heartbeats, and when it finally comes, there's no surprise, only recognition. I picked up my last gun, slung it over my shoulder, and walked to the edge of the camp to wait. The shuttle came down an hour later. Inquisitorial markings on the hull, stylized I in gold on black, flanked by icons I didn't recognize. It landed on the packed earth strip we used for supply drops, its engines kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over everything like a fine brown shroud. The ramp lowered. 4 people came out. The first 2 were soldiers, not guard, but inquisitorial stormtroopers, men in polished carapace armor with hellguns held across their chests and helmets that concealed everything except their chins. They moved with the mechanical precision of men who had been trained to kill efficiently and without hesitation, and they took up flanking positions at the base of the ramp with the ease of long practice. The third was a woman. She wore a gray robe with a hood pulled forward, and her hands were covered in thin gloves of some dark material. She moved slowly, carefully, as if the air around her was fragile, and she was trying not to break it. A psyker. I had encountered sanctioned psychers before, during briefings and strategic planning sessions, and they all had that same quality, that sense of someone navigating a world that was slightly different from the one the rest of us inhabited. This one had it more than most. She seemed to be listening to something I couldn't hear. The fourth was the Inquisitor. He was not what I expected, though I'm not sure what I expected. He was tall, lean, older than me by perhaps a decade, with gray hair cropped close to his skull, and a face that was all angles and sharp planes, like someone had carved it from a block of pale stone and forgotten to smooth the edges. He wore a long coat of dark gray, armored at the shoulders and chest, and he carried no visible weapon. He didn't need one. He had the stormtroopers and the psyker, and the full weight of the Inquisitorial rosette that hung around his neck on a chain of blackened silver. He walked down the ramp as if he owned the planet, which, in a sense, he did. An Inquisitor's authority supersedes everything. Governor General, even the Ecclesiarch himself bows to the rosette. He introduced himself as Inquisitor Osivan Drether, Ordo Hereticus. His voice was deep and measured, each word placed with the same deliberate care that a demolitions expert uses when placing charges. He told me that he had been investigating my case for 5 years, that he had reviewed my service record, Commissar Drave's unpublished notes, which had apparently survived Drave's death and found their way into Inquisitorial archives, and Interrogator Udo's report, which had indeed been filed before her death and had been waiting in a data stack for over a decade before Drethier had found it. He said that the convergence of evidence required direct investigation, and that he had come to Drenavar specifically for me. I asked him if he intended to execute me. He said that would depend on what he found. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which the Drenavar campaign continued around us like weather, fighting and dying on a dozen fronts, while I sat in a prefabricated examination cell inside the Inquisitor's shuttle and submitted to a battery of tests that made Interrogator Udo's interrogation look like a casual conversation. Blood samples, genetic analysis, cognitive mapping, stress response evaluation, psycho-conditioning resistance tests, theological examination conducted by a junior confessor who asked me detailed questions about my beliefs and my dreams and my understanding of the Emperor's divine nature, all while a biometric scanner monitored my physiological responses for signs of deception. I passed everything. Every test came back clean. My blood was normal. My genetics were standard hive world human, with no detectable mutation or enhancement. My cognitive function was within expected parameters for a man of my age and service history. My stress responses were dampened, which the examiner noted as consistent with prolonged combat exposure, but within the range of observed variation among long-service veterans. My psycho-conditioning resistance was unremarkable. My theological beliefs were orthodox, if not particularly fervent. I believed in the Emperor. I believed he protected. I believed in the duty of service. I did not believe in anything that the ecclesiarchy would consider heretical. The confessor signed off on my spiritual evaluation with a notation that said, "No evidence of moral corruption," though the subject displays emotional flatness consistent with prolonged trauma. Drethi also examined the physical record. He had his stormtroopers retrieve every piece of equipment I had used over the past 6 years, every LAS gun, every flak vest, every pair of boots. They scanned them for anomalous energy signatures, residual warp traces, hidden mechanisms. They found nothing. He had the camp's engineer examine my bionic components, of which I had none, and my augmetics, of which I had none. He had a Margos from a nearby forge installation conduct a full material analysis of my blood, my hair, my skin cells, my saliva. The Magos reported that I was, in his precise and mechanical phrasing, a biological organism of standard human composition with no detectable deviation from established genetic or biochemical parameters. Draithe thanked the Magos, dismissed him, and sat alone in his quarters for the rest of that day. When he emerged, there was a hardness in his expression that had not been there before, the look of a man who had exhausted every rational avenue and was now preparing to venture into territory where rationality no longer applied. On the 18th day, Dretha brought in the Psyker. Her name was Varese. No rank, no title, just Varese, which I assumed was either a given name or a sanctioned alias. She was younger than I'd initially thought, perhaps 30, though the hollows under her eyes and the premature lines around her mouth made her look older. She had the pallor of someone who spent most of their time in spaces without natural light, and her hands trembled slightly when they weren't occupied, a common trait among psychers who had undergone the soul binding. When she entered the examination cell, the temperature dropped by several degrees. Not literally, not physically, but something in the atmosphere of the room changed, as if a door had been opened to a colder place. Draithe told me that Varese was going to conduct a psychic examination. He said it would not be pleasant. He said I should try to remain still and calm, and that any resistance, conscious or unconscious, would make the process more difficult. He did not say for whom. Varese sat across from me and removed her gloves. Her hands were covered in fine white scars, geometric patterns that had been deliberately cut into the skin and allowed to heal. She placed her fingertips against my temples, and the room went away. I don't have the vocabulary to describe what Varese did to me. I am not a psyker. I do not perceive the warp. My relationship with the Immaterium is the same as any other baseline humans, which is to say, it's a wall I can't see on the other side of. But Varese opened a window in that wall just for a moment, just wide enough for her to look through, and what she saw made her scream. It was not a loud scream. It was worse than that. It was a small, choked sound, the kind a person makes when they've seen something that their mind is refusing to process, when the information coming in through their eyes is so fundamentally wrong that the brain shuts down its vocal output to conserve resources for the task of not breaking. Varese's fingers tightened on my temples until her nails drew blood and her eyes rolled back in her head, showing the whites. And for 3 seconds she was somewhere else, seeing something that existed in the space between my thoughts. Then she let go. She pulled her hands away from my face as if my skin had burned her, and she fell backward off her chair and scrambled across the floor until her back hit the wall. She was breathing in rapid, shallow gasps, and her nose was bleeding, a thin stream of bright red that ran down her upper lip and dripped onto the collar of her robe. Dretha was at her side immediately, kneeling beside her, one hand on her shoulder. He asked her what she had seen. She didn't answer right away. She sat there, shaking, bleeding, staring at me with an expression I had never seen on another human face. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. There was something attached to me, she said. Not a demon, not a possessing entity, not a psychic parasite in any form she had been trained to recognize. It existed in what she called the liminal space, the boundary layer between the materium and the immaterium where reality was thinnest, pressed against my soul like a hand pressed against a pane of glass, and it had been there for as long as I had been alive, aware but not conscious, not intelligent. It operated on instinct, on a single overriding imperative that it had been executing without variation or deviation for 50 years. Protect, survive, keep this one alive. During the gaps, she explained, the moments when my awareness stuttered and I found myself in a different position, the entity was acting. Not controlling my body, but displacing it, nudging me through the liminal space from one point to another, the way you might push a piece on a game board. One square to the left, 2 squares back, out of the path of the bullet, the blast, the blade. It was fast, faster than thought, and it was precise. It knew with a certainty that transcended calculation exactly where the danger was and exactly where I needed to be to avoid it. Dretha leaned forward. What was it? Ressik shook her head. She didn't know. It didn't feel like anything in her training manuals, anything in the Ordo's extensive catalog of warp phenomena. It was too small to be a demon, too focused to be a psychic echo, too persistent to be a residual manifestation. It was something else, something she had no name for. Dretha asked if it was dangerous. Ressik looked at me, and the expression on her face shifted from fear to something worse. Pity. The most dangerous thing she had ever encountered, she whispered. Not because of what it was, but because of how it worked. The entity didn't generate its own energy. It couldn't. It was too small, too weak, too fragmentary. It drew its energy from the only source available to it: death. Specifically, the deaths of those in proximity to me. Each time someone near me died, the entity absorbed a fraction of the released life energy, the brief flare of psychic light that accompanies every human death, and used it to sustain itself and to power its protective function. Every squad that had been wiped out around me, every comrade who had taken the bullet meant for me, every impossible near miss that had killed someone else instead. They hadn't just died in combat. Their deaths had fed the entity. It had consumed them the way a furnace consumes fuel, burning their lives to keep mine lit. 50 years, hundreds of engagements, thousands of dead, all of them fuel. The room was very quiet when she finished. Dretha sat in his chair without moving, his hands folded on the table, his face unreadable. Ressik was still on the floor, her back against the wall, her nose no longer bleeding, but her eyes still fixed on me with that terrible pity. I sat in my chair and felt the examination cells shrink around me until the walls were close enough to touch. I had wanted answers. Udo had given me nothing. Drave had given me mathematics. Ressik had given me the truth, and the truth was worse than any of the possibilities I had allowed myself to imagine during the long years of not thinking about it. And I understood, finally, what the Dark Eldar on Vandrek Majoris had seen when it looked at me and hesitated. It had seen the entity. Those Xynos lived in the spaces between the real and the unreal, fed on suffering and the soul's raw edges, and one of them had looked at me and recognized something pressed against the glass of my being that wore a shape it knew. Not prey, something that fed the same way it did. But Dretha was not finished. He had the answer to what, but he didn't have the answer to why. The entity had been seated in me since birth, Ressik said, but something had activated it, charged it, given it the power to operate. That meant 2 events, not 1. Something had happened at my birth, and something else had happened afterward. Dretha, being thorough in the way that only Inquisitors can be, had already investigated. He had sent agents to Vothune Tertius months before coming to Drenavar. They had pulled records, interviewed workers, examined my family history and the circumstances of my birth. And they had found something. He told me about my mother, not the version I knew, the tired woman with press burns on her arms who had stood in the doorway of our HAB unit and watched me march away without speaking. Dretha told me the version that the records held, the version that had been buried in the Administratum's filing system under layers of routine bureaucracy and never flagged because no one had been looking. My mother had been a psyker, not a powerful one, not the kind that the black ships came for, the kind that blazed like a torch in the warp and drew the attention of everything that lurked in the dark between stars. She was what the Scholastica Psychana classified as a Psi Epsilon, the lowest measurable grade of psychic potential, barely above baseline human. A flicker, a spark so faint that the routine screening conducted during her childhood on Vothune had missed it entirely. Or more likely, the screener had noted it and dismissed it as within acceptable variance. Psi Epsilons were common in hive populations. Most went their entire lives without manifesting, without ever knowing they carried the gene. They were background noise, statistically insignificant, administratively irrelevant. But my mother had manifested. Not in any dramatic way, not with lightning or fire or the screaming of demons. Her manifestation was small, subtle, and entirely unconscious. She had a gift, if you could call it that, for knowing when danger was close. A low-grade precognitive sense that expressed itself as a feeling, a tightening in the gut, a coldness at the base of the skull, an urge to move, to dodge, to step left when every rational calculation said to step right. It had kept her alive in the manufactorum for 20 years, steering her away from press malfunctions, chemical spills, structural collapses. Her co-workers thought she was lucky. She thought she was careful. Neither of them was right. When she went into labor with me, something went wrong. The birth was difficult, complicated, nearly fatal. The medici at the Hab-level clinic were not equipped to handle what was happening, and by the time they stabilized her, something had already occurred that no medici would have had the tools to detect. During the crisis, at the moment when her body was closest to failing, her psychic ability had flared in response to the extremity of her distress. Not outward, not visibly, but inward, directed at the child she was fighting to deliver. A seed was planted, an imprint of her will, her desperate need to keep me safe, burned into the psychic substrate of my newborn existence. Not the full entity, not yet. A weak, nascent thing, barely functional, capable of nudging but not of true intervention. A promise waiting to be kept. She survived. Weakened, diminished in ways the Hab-level medici could not diagnose, but alive. She raised me. She worked the press line. She paused at thresholds. She watched me leave for the tithe with her hands hanging at her sides and burns on her forearms, and I walked away without saying goodbye because I thought I'd be back. Drath's agents had traced the rest through Munitorum records and Hab-block death registries. 7 months after I shipped out on the vessel of appropriate burden, my mother died. A press malfunction in Manufactorium Aleph 12. The mechanism that she had operated for 20 years seized, kicked back, and crushed her at her station. The official record said it was instantaneous. But Dretha didn't believe that, and neither did Verise when she reviewed the findings. They believed that in the fractions of a second between the malfunction and the end, her psychic ability had flared one final time, pouring everything she had left, everything she was, into the seed she had planted 18 years before. A mother dying alone in a manufactorum on a world her son would never see again, and her last conscious act was not fear, not pain, but a single thought hurled across the void, with every scrap of psychic energy her failing mind could produce. Keep him safe. The seed received that final charge and became the echo, and the echo never stopped. My mother's last thought, her last breath, her last act of consciousness was to protect me, and that thought had never stopped. For 50 years, it had been operating in the space between my soul and the warp, a tiny fragment of psychic will with no mind, no memory, no awareness of what it was or what it was doing. It had only its imperative: keep him safe, keep him alive. And it had fulfilled that imperative with a relentless, mindless dedication that had consumed thousands of lives in the process. Every man who had died in my kill radius had died because my mother loved me. Every squad wipe, every sole survivor report, every impossible near miss, every time the bullet hit the man beside me instead of me, every time the shell landed where I had been standing a second before, every time the blade passed over my head by a centimeter, all of it was her. Not deliberately, not consciously. She had been dead since before I'd even finished my first year of service. But the echo of her remained, and that echo was hungry, and it fed on the dying to keep its promise. Dratha gave me time to absorb this. He sat quietly while I stared at the wall and felt the packed-away items in my mind break free of their containers, flooding through the partitions I had so carefully maintained, filling every space with the weight of what I now understood. The gaps, the blackouts, the moments of displacement. All of them were her, the ghost of a woman I barely remembered, reaching across 50 years of death to push her son out of the path of the bullet one more time. I asked Dratha what would happen now. He told me. The entity, the echo, whatever you chose to call it, could not be separated from me. It was woven into the fabric of my psychic presence, such as it was, tangled with the baseline warp signature that every human carries. Removing it would require either the intervention of a psyker of extraordinary power, which Ressik was not, or my death. And even if removal were possible, Dratha said, the entity had grown. 50 years of constant feeding, 50 years of absorbing the death energy of soldiers killed in my proximity, had increased its strength by several orders of magnitude beyond what a dying Psi Epsilon should have been capable of producing. It was no longer a flicker. It was not yet a flame, but it was growing toward one. Ressik estimated that within another decade of active combat, the entity would accumulate enough energy to cross a threshold. She did not specify what that threshold was, but the way she said it, the way her voice dropped and her hands clenched in her lap, told me everything I needed to know about what lay on the other side of it. I was a vessel, a carrier, a host for something that had begun as a mother's dying wish, and had become, through 50 years of war and death, something that was approaching a power and complexity that would qualify it as a genuine warp entity. Not a demon, not in the theological sense, but something that would be functionally indistinguishable from one. Something that fed on death, something that could not be controlled, something that would eventually outgrow its imperative and become something else entirely. Dratha was silent for a long time after he finished explaining. Then he offered me a choice. He said there were those within the Ordos who would see value in what I carried. A man who could not be killed, sent to the most desperate engagements, the most impossible missions. Alone, always alone, but alive, and serving the Imperium in a capacity that no other soldier could. He said he could arrange it. Permanent deployment to the worst war zones, operating without support, without comrades, a one-man expendable force whose survival was guaranteed by the thing living inside him. He said the entity would continue to protect me. He said the deaths it caused would be enemy combatants rather than fellow soldiers, provided I fought alone. I asked him if it would stop growing. He hesitated. Ressik, still on the floor with her back against the wall, answered for him. She said no. Every death near me fed it, regardless of whose death it was. Human, Xenos, heretic. The entity didn't discriminate. It consumed whatever died in its radius. A decade of solo combat on chaos-held worlds would feed it just as surely as a decade of fighting alongside guardsmen. Slower, perhaps, if the deaths were less frequent. But the trajectory would not change. Eventually, the threshold would be reached. Eventually, the echo of my mother's love would become something that had nothing to do with love at all. Dretha told me his verdict. I was not guilty of heresy. I was not guilty of corruption. I was not guilty of anything at all by any standard of imperial law or moral code. I was a victim, the last victim of a woman who had died trying to save me and had succeeded too well. But the entity could not be allowed to continue. The risk was too great. The deaths were too many. The future, if the entity reached its threshold, was too terrible to contemplate. And then he told me the thing that mattered. He could not kill me. He knew that. No one could. A firing squad would die before I did. A blade would turn. Poison would find its way into someone else's cup. The entity would not permit my death by any hand but one, and that hand was mine. He had not come to Drenevar to execute me, because execution was not possible. He had come to ask me to do the only thing that could end it. To stand still when the echo told me to move. To refuse once the gift my mother had spent 50 years and 1,000 lives trying to give me. He asked me what I wanted. He did not have to ask. The answer had been forming in me since Verisa screamed, since the moment I understood what every death around me had really been, since Varadne Kos died 3 meters from me at Station Venik, and I felt the gap pull me sideways to safety while she bled out on the ground. I chose to stop. I asked for one thing. I asked him to let me stand. Not on my knees, not bound to a post, not drugged or sedated or rendered compliant by the Psyker's art. I wanted to be on my feet, with my eyes open, facing the weapons. He understood why. The Hellguns were not what would kill me, and both of us knew it. The Hellguns were only there to give the Echo something to save me from, one last time, so that I could refuse it. He considered the request for a moment, then agreed. Perhaps he respected it. Perhaps he simply understood that a man who was about to do what I was about to do had earned the right to do it standing. They took me outside. The Drenevar sun was low on the horizon, turning the sky a dull orange that reminded me of the glow of slag cooling in the troughs on Vothun. The stormtroopers formed a line, 4 of them, hellguns raised. Dretha stood to one side, his arms folded. Verisa stood behind him, her hands trembling, her lips moving in what might have been a prayer. Around us, the forward operating base was empty. Dretha had cleared it, sent everyone else beyond the perimeter wire. If the Echo took the stormtroopers, he wanted no one else close enough to feed it. I stood facing the stormtroopers and felt the air change, a coldness at the base of my skull, a tightening in my gut. The same feeling my mother had carried her whole life, the warning that danger was close. The Echo stirring, sensing the threat, preparing to do what it had done 1,000 times before. I felt the edges of my vision begin to blur, the familiar softening that preceded the gap, the moment where I would blink out of existence and reappear somewhere safe, while the energy of my death was redirected into someone else. The stormtroopers, probably. 4 more lives consumed to keep the promise. I thought about Harad Brennick, who had taught me to hold a lasgun and died in 2 pieces on a jungle floor. I thought about Lorne Vedenak, who had told me which insects would lay eggs in my ears and bled out 3 meters away from me. I thought about Brennick Cull, who had told me he wanted to go home to his wife and was crushed inside his own loader harness. I thought about Varadne Kos, who had sat beside me in silence and asked for nothing, and died 3 meters from me with a Xenos claw in her throat. I thought about Kosindral, who had believed in redemption and whose headless body had stood upright for a full second before it fell. I thought about Enoch Drave, who had walked into my kill radius with his recorder running because the truth mattered more to him than living. I thought about Interrogator Udo, who had told me I was ordinary. I thought about 100 others whose names I had stopped learning and whose faces I had packed away. All of them fuel. All of them consumed by my mother's last breath. All of them dead so I could live. The gap began to open. I felt it like a door swinging inward, the familiar absence starting at the edges and working toward the center, reaching for me, ready to pull me through to the other side where safety waited, where it always waited, where it had waited for 50 years, patient and reliable and bottomless in its hunger. I closed the door. I had no training, no psychic ability, no way to fight a thing like that on its own ground. But I didn't have to fight it on its own ground. The echo had no body of its own. It had only mine. Every time it had saved me by moving me, and it could not move me if I refused to be moved. It was not a duel of strength. It was a matter of standing still. So I stood still. I planted my feet and I would not let it take me, and it pushed against the inside of my own skull with 50 years of stolen lives, and I was 50 years of tired, and I was done. Done walking out of the smoke, done blinking blood out of my eyes that wasn't mine, done being the last man standing in a field of corpses that had died to keep me breathing. The stormtroopers fired. I stayed where I was. The light was very bright and very brief, and then it was over. The echo reached for me one final time, and for the first time in 50 years, it found no one there to save.